Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and today I have the privilege to sit down with a longtime friend and colleague, Ambassador Toby Feakin. Dr. Feakin served as Australia's inaugural Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technologies and has been a longtime proponent of cyber issues for as long as we've been working together. So really excited to have Ambassador Feakin visiting from down under and look forward to today's discussion. Toby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure, Frank.
So I thought we should start with the discussion around the threat environment in the region. Mm-hmm. And Australia has taken a number of steps. You were a big proponent of a number of the steps that they've taken. Can't have a discussion without bringing up China in the region, but tell me how you sort of saw the threat picture, that threat environment, and how it changed when you were in that role as ambassador.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and something that Australia continually has to balance is this kind of multifaceted relationship with China, which is not telling anyone they don't know, but it's balancing the economic ties that you have with such a behemoth in the Asia Pacific and globally economically, alongside a growing understanding of security risk. Okay, mm-hmm. It's almost like the age-old concerns that any leadership or senior official has to guide their country through. How do you balance those and come out somewhere in the sweet spot in the middle? And I would say, during my time in the ambassador role, I certainly arrived in government, and I would say the period between 2016 through to 2022, I would say, you could term it the security first policy in many respects. It was the understanding that maybe the balance had been tipped a bit too far in favor of the economic side, and that a lot of our security architecture was perhaps undercooked. And part of that realization was really recognizing the cyber threat from China and vocalizing that to the public, making a broader awareness of what that threat looked like, how it manifested, and making that quite public, which was very new. And there was a lot of nervousness at the time about the idea that you would talk more openly about cyber adversaries, whoever they were, but especially China. Mm-hmm. And it took a while, but we did get to the point of being able to publicly attribute a set of activities to China, and it was the Cloud Hopper incident, which, for the nerdy ones who are listening here, and I'm sure there's a few, and obviously you'd remember it, Frank, that was the first time that Australia come out publicly and said things about China and how their Ministry of State Security were operating in cyberspace. So, sorry.
No. So I'd be curious. It's good to see public acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. Why was that important?
Well, simply, first and foremost, the fact that it had never been done, and don't underestimate the bravery of a government system to be able to put things on the record. Mm-hmm. Often a lot of what happens in government goes on quietly behind the scenes, and there's so much of it that the public will never ever see. But the sense that this was a significant enough threat to broader businesses and the public was important in making sure that they were brought into that conversation. So not least of all to raise awareness, but also to protect your critical infrastructure, your businesses, because at that point we'd got much better at sharing threat intelligence and threat signatures. And that in of itself was no small step, because we were converting incredibly classified material. You would get stuff landing on your desk which had all sorts of weird and wonderful code words on it.
Sometimes from allies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'd sit there scratching your head thinking, there's something really important that industry need to know here. How do you strip out the material that would make it that classified and make sure that this is actionable from wherever you are in society? So part of that is being able to vocalize what the threat is so others can defend themselves better. And therefore, as a nation, you're much better defended. So that was clearly part of that, if you like, security first approach that was starting to take place or did take place for a majority of the time that I was in the role.
And clearly significant from an op tempo and threat perspective, or we would still be keeping this pretty quiet in the security service world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if anything, to rush forward to very recent events, it struck me, I was outside of government at this time, and you see the way that the Volt Typhoon issue has kind of sent shockwaves, and it should do. I mean, I say that. And so many incidents, I sit there thinking, yeah, this will really change the game. Everyone's going to suddenly up the bar of what they're doing in cybersecurity, and so often I'm left a bit disappointed because it doesn't seem to resonate strong enough. But Volt Typhoon, again, the idea that you would be publicly talking about prepositioning on critical infrastructure assets by another nation state. I mean, I raised my eyebrows because that is really quite significant issues you're talking about there. That's the real danger zone, right? And so for me, that shows how adventurous, if you like, China has become in what it's prepared to
calculated.
do. Absolutely. And
we'll pull the thread on Volt Typhoon in a second,
sure.
but I also want to sort of get a sense of regionally.
Yes.
And more often you see reports coming out with the seals of our Five Eyes partners, but also increasingly South Korea, Japan, and others. And I'd be curious, where did some of your regional partners, and how critical was that in your role as ambassador to bring regional partners on board and the like?
It was an absolute fundamental part of the job, was bouncing around the Asia Pacific, engaging with partners to talk to them about what their issues were, what the threat environment was as far as they saw it, and as far as possible share information about what we were seeing. Mm-hmm. And that was super important to build awareness, and then to see were there ways that we could assist in upskilling, in upgrading cybersecurity. There's nothing more powerful than a regional partner being able to see for themselves with their own capability what's going on their network. And that tied in very heavily to the kinds of capacity building work that we would do in the region. It was all about trying to helping country create capability and visibility of what's going on, because that informs strategic decision-making beyond the cyber domain, right? And the bigger game, if you like, that's going on out there. So it's vital.
Which is all trust, right? At the end of the day, a lot of technical and technological elements and components, but if you lack trust, it's all kind of moot and irrelevant, right?
100%. And I would say a part of that security-first approach during 2016 was absolutely reaching out to partners and just raising awareness as to what was going on from our point of view and what was going on domestically in Australia, and trying to find out what was going on with partners. And what I would say has happened now as we, in 2024, you see a much better awareness of what's going on domestic networks around the Asia Pacific, and understanding more clearly of what that threat looks like, how it manifests. And I say there's still a bit of a journey to go on in terms of responses, but you mentioned it. I mean, one of the really fantastic things that's happened recently is the APT-40 attribution, led by Australia, but joined by South Korea and Japan. Now, my memory from when I initially started working on trying to bring this broader partnership approach to vocalizing the threat in the region was a distinct nervousness from countries like that. It was not the way of doing business.
And understandably, Australia too was going through that until they did lean forward, right?
We did, absolutely, and still remember the nervousness at the time of when we did that, but it was an important step to take, and it's great to see partners doing that. And I think a really important aspect of that attribution, and this gets into the weeds, but again, we've got some nerdy folk who'll be digging into the weeds of this, right? Which is great. It's good. Embrace your nerddom, everyone. It's the best way and the only way. Is when you look at that attribution, it was done through intelligence channels, which is a slight shift from the way that attributions were done during my time, which was much more through foreign ministries. Foreign ministries still playing a clear role, but it was done through distinct technical detail. And that means that those linkages now are much more shored up between agencies in our region, and it means that there's a more fluid information flow, which can only be super helpful, again, in creating awareness, building trust, to your point, Frank, which is especially vital when you're into the very secret world. And that means, I think, that you will only see more confidence going forward for other countries in the region to join attributions, to say what they're seeing within their own networks.
And not to call out laggards, but who do you think did it right in terms of regional and capacity building programs, and who maybe needs a little bit of work?
Do you mean in particular countries who was doing well, or do you mean
yes.
which
Firstly,
country was providing the best support?
Not providing the best support in the region I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, one thing to say about the region is it's really important as a broader framing statement.
That economics play a big role in, right?
Exactly. And you're dealing with a region where you have some of the least connected and economically underprivileged countries almost in the world, right? But then you're also dealing, on the other hand, with some of the most sophisticated, highly connected, highly technological, advanced countries anywhere on the planet. And that does create a bit of a kind of, challenge, absolutely. How do you frame that? And it does create this kind of winners and losers scenario. And it creates complexity because you do have China playing very distinctly in there with the price point argument.
Exactly. And we're going to get to supply chain too.
Great. I'm really glad about that. I was hoping we would. So that's what you're in the game with. You've seen some fast movers who, I would say, let me talk more about that middle ground, okay? The guys who are moving fast, I think. You've seen some really helpful upshift in capability from countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. And you see the models that they're following, and in many respects, they're being close observers and watchers of what countries like the US have been doing models like CISA, like Australian Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, and they're starting to copy that model. They see it as a valid, useful way of upskilling their own capability for government. And so for me, they're starting to move strongly. One area which is still, if you like, a weak spot and requires ever more of our attention. I spent a lot of time in the Pacific Islands, and part of their journey is to become ever more connected for their economic well-being. But that does bring an awful lot of nasties with it, and that was something we were trying to manage. We were building and going into the infrastructure piece. We built the Coral Sea cable, which was linking up Pacific Islands. You're now seeing a vast array of new cabling projects coming in through the Pacific, and it's great to see that it's in partnership with other governments, with industry partners. So glad to see that. But again, it requires, if you like, that risk management piece, which is better cybersecurity delivered with that increased connectivity.
I'm actually glad you brought up undersea cables. I wasn't planning on going here, but the reality is kinetic attacks on cyber infrastructure, cyber attacks on physical infrastructure that can have a physical and kinetic outcome. We need to start thinking about this much more holistically, right? So it's not just the zeros and ones and the geeks that we all love and embrace, but it's also physical, and undersea is a tough challenge, yes?
100%, and I think it's always an interesting leap of imagination. You go down the pub, or, well, you don't have to go down the pub, at the restaurant.
There are pubs in the US too.
Yeah, exactly. But, the family meal with dinner time, obviously you're going to talk about the internet. I guarantee you a lot of people would struggle to name the physical infrastructure that underpins it. It's, the internet, cloud. You kind of look upwards and imagine where this mystical thing is coming from. And if you ask me, one thing that concerns me, if you like, the weakest link in the actual physical infrastructure that puts this together, it is the undersea cabling.
You and me both.
And countries...
In space, but we will...
We're going to go everywhere. I love this, Frank. Let's keep it rolling. But for me, that's difficult because you are then very directly into the physical world. It's carrying an extortionate amount of the traffic, a majority of the world's internet traffic and data, and countries have developed distinct capabilities to be able to tap into that. And not least of all, the fact that these cables can be disrupted by natural causes as well. So for me, that's a huge risk point, and we need more redundancy in terms of cabling and how that is dealt with and how it's monitored.
So you brought up earlier Volt Typhoon, and I think when you think about some of the undersea, and you sort of mentioned tapping, it's understandable for espionage purposes. Well, Typhoon had zero espionage value, at least what we're seeing right now. It did from an intelligence preparation of the battlefield, but not from an economic or even stealing military secrets. It's prepositioning. What do you think that opened up new eyes in Australia and elsewhere, or were they already well versed in this and they're like, duh, we knew this was going to happen? What's your thinking right now?
I would say from my time in government, prepositioning was a conversation that we would have in government, but as I said, it was in very much darkened rooms and highly classified conversations. So I absolutely won't go there in terms of what we were talking about. But when you see the outing of information that the US government was brave enough to put out there in public, it absolutely should concern not just other governments, but it should concern industry because they are the guys, as we well know, who operate a majority of infrastructure, and they need to know clearly that's the level of threat they're dealing with. You know, we used to talk a lot about SCADA systems, how open they were to internet-facing networks. And
they still are.
Absolutely. You know, you feel like there's been a bit of a shift in terms of attention on that and securing that weak link in the chain. But when you magnify that to the level, you know, that's the A team that you're sending after. To preposition, you're trying to place malicious malware on a network without it being seen or observed. So you're sending your A team to do that. That's not the kind of cowboys in the back room.
Exactly.
And so industry need to understand that that is what they're dealing with in that sector. And I think other countries should be clear-eyed in understanding when you're dealing with prepositioning, as you said, Frank, you know, that's there for just-in-case scenarios. You don't want to be caught. They're not looking to be caught out, but it's there for as and when you get into that horrific, God forbid, scenario of, you know, on the cusp of warfare, because that's where you're getting to. If you're attacking directly another country's infrastructure, you know, that's why many diplomats spent so long at the UN talking about critical infrastructure being out of bounds. It's for that exact reason, because if you attack another country's infrastructure, you get very directly into international law and what that means for declaration. And I'm not
Which
trying
is still
to
a bit of a
overstate
gray area, isn't it?
Absolutely, and there's still tremendous amount of work to do that for countries.
So you brought up Taiwan. I'm not going to ask you to be a gambler here, but how do you see that playing out?
You mean more from a conventional point of view? I mean, I'd certainly say Taiwan gets everything thrown at it. It's often referred to, you know, like Ukraine was always the testing ground for anything cyber malicious that Russia could come up with. They would be testing out there. Same thing for Taiwan. It's, you know, for years now they've been dealing with all sorts of cyber incidents of, you know, misinformation, disinformation, interference. And I got to see a real kind of first-hand view of that on my visits there, which was eye-opening, especially when you think how long ago that actually was now.
Absolutely.
So it was instructional for me in understanding what that environment looked like. You're talking about, I guess, the kind of, again, God forbid, scenario of an invasion.
Of one sort or another, whether physical or otherwise.
Well, I mean, it's certainly come to everyone's clear attention now how central Taiwan is to, if
our
you like,
economy.
Well, to our economy, to our technology supply chain, to absolutely high-end chipsets and the unbelievable, if you like, focus of production that is taking place in that country and on that island. I mean, it's been...
Which cannot be replicated overnight. So I'm a big proponent of onshoring certain capabilities, but it takes time.
It does take time, but I also think here that the whole approach from the US on the semiconductor front has been one of the most successful supply chain policies, at very least since the end of the Cold War, even maybe before. And that's a strong statement to make.
Yeah, that is a strong statement.
But if you look at the shifts that has made in 2 years, the sheer amounts of money that have been invested, but also what that has enabled over 2 years, it's absolutely phenomenal when you study where the new centers of gravity are appearing. Okay, some of the players are still the likely suspects, the TSMCs, the Samsungs, the
And
Intels.
we're always going to friendship. That's actually healthy. But
Exactly. But it's leading to new investments of large sums of money into parts of the region that I'm in Malaysia. You know, you're seeing new plants established in India, and also it's onshoring back into the US market. You know, the US market share in high-end chips, it was less than 10% at the beginning of that process. It's now over 10%, and you'll be looking at, I think, around 2030, you should be up to around 30+% of that. That is a phenomenal shift in a market in a very short space of time. So I think that's been successful. But what's important there is that there's not complacency about creating that air gap.
Yeah.
You know, I would predict there's about a 5-year gap of leadership in that space. You can't afford complacency. If you've created that gap and spent the money, time, and effort to create that strategic advantage in a technology space, you then need to capitalize on it equally as fast. Otherwise, be prepared for the Chinese innovation system to work overtime. You know, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? And certainly you will see their innovation cycle rapidly increase around the restrictions that have been placed on it.
And there is some hubris, I would argue, still even in the United States, that China are all imitators. They're innovating. They're innovating pretty fast, are they not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, your point is exactly right, Frank. If you remember, because we're of a certain age and we've known each other this long and we've been doing these kinds of assessments. Exactly. You know, if you look back to the early 2010s and some of, I think, the quite lazy analysis that was being done on China, cyber, IP theft, it was along the lines of, well, they're hoovering up data, but let's face it, they're not going to know what to do and innovate around that data. I think we've been proven incredibly wrong on that assessment, right? And the danger is that you could fall into that gap again of saying, haven't we done well? We spent a lot of money. We've created this advantage. Let's have a breather here. But unfortunately, where we find ourselves now in this technological convergence moment of this array of emerging technologies, quantum, cyber capabilities, AI. Thanks, Frank. We'll keep moving on this. But if you look at that tech convergence, you cannot afford to sit still for 1 second, because it's all moving at such a fast rate that even the developers themselves have no idea where this journey's ending up. But what we do know is that from a state perspective, you must be leading the development of those technologies to the final end product, because if you do, you're at the front of the global power structures of the 21st century. And so it is a race, and we need to get there first.
And it has very significant consequences beyond just national interests, also autocratic, democratic, and I do want to get into that discussion. But before we jump there, my philosophy on that is either jump on the bus or you're going to be run over by that bus. It's as simple as that. But before we go to some of the major geopolitical and technological sets of issues, let's talk supply chain for 1 second.
Sure.
So I still am under the impression that we don't have full visibility into our supply chains. We all know the big ones, the Huaweis, the ZTEs, and clearly some of those sorts of major companies, Hikvision when it comes to all sorts of technology, all sorts of cameras and the like. But what has Australia done there to try to get visibility? Do most executives of the equivalent of the Fortune 500 in Australia, are they aware?
So to some degree...
Could they tell you, like, every time we have a solar winds, it's almost as if, do we even have it in our systems? And I feel like I've seen this movie over and over and over, but it is harder than it, because it's multiple layers of supply that you have to go down to. But
I think it's a great question to ask, and I think it is one of the zeitgeists of the moment is, do you really understand your supply chain? I mean, it feels like we've been talking about supply chain for an awful long time. A long time. But unfortunately, some of these messages take even longer to embed themselves into corporate behaviors and understandings. So in reference to Australian industry, it's variable. And I would imagine it's very true also in the US system. Sure. But one of the reasons that I think, governments have begun to grow tired of that patchwork quilt of accepting risk. So you are seeing
regulations that are unsteady in that, right?
Exactly.
We need to harmonize. So.
To a degree. And I think I'm not convinced that we will get to a harmonization point, because what you are seeing right now, it might come further down the line, but what's happening right now are that governments are becoming far more interventionist with the policies they take, far more direct in the spend that they will create in R&D. We've just been talking about it in the semiconductor sense. In Australia, we've just invested $1 billion in a quantum computing facility in Brisbane. but also in terms of the directness of intervention into the market. It used to be if you sat in a Western country, you would say market forces will create efficiencies, they'll understand risk because it's a hit on their bottom line. No, it's not happened to the degree, and you're seeing that governments now are intervening much more directly. We wouldn't have talked about an issue like, we wouldn't have used a term like data sovereignty 5 years ago. Now it's a commonplace part of the lexicon of any Western government. I mean, I spent a disproportionate amount of my time fighting that language at the UN and various other bodies. I mean, honestly, wow. And now we're here, and fair enough. You know, that's the path that governments are taking. It's about onshoring of data. It's about sovereignty and ownership of technology, and that comes directly to your supply chain question. And my sense is that the market is still not quite there where it needs to be, and understanding the entirety of not just your immediate suppliers, but their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers, because that's expensive and takes a long time for companies to do. So not every company is willing to go to that degree. Some are, and they're fantastic at it. And thank goodness for those companies, but there need to be more who are going to be diligent in that space.
And even those that are diligent, it's tough, right? Unless they have some support from our government and from the in particular from entities that actually can provide the intelligence and information.
Well, and let's face it, if we go back to that market forces piece, if it's going to be financially worth their time as well. And it does come down to a bit of market economics as well. And so if a board, and this is where I work a lot now, if a board decide that the financial risk and the reputational risk isn't worth their while, well, that's where I would like to be implanted to help them understand that, right? And talk them through what that means from a reputational point of view, from not only with their customers but with the government that they're working with.
What about critical infrastructure? I think when I think of Australia, ports, rail, so critical to the economy, to shipping and everything else. Are they there?
Getting there much, much better than they were. For us in Australia, we had a couple of canary in the coal mine moments. And one of those, I'm sure, and we're probably thinking about the same ones. There was a Darwin port up in the north that had a rather large Chinese contract signed up, which was in a very sensitive area of the world, and that was the beginning of the wake-up call. But the real hammer, if you like, the hammer blow was around 5G decisions, where Australia made the world's first decision of not allowing high-risk vendors into their new infrastructure builds. And that ethos has continued in Australia in making much more rigorous assessments of not only where does the equipment come from, but where does the money flow from, and in that sense, where do the people come from, and understanding that mix around very sensitive areas of infrastructure build. And I think, the next, if you like, area of concern is around areas that China is innovating so wonderfully well around, which is electric vehicles, right? The boom in the Chinese electrical vehicle market creates a very similar problem set.
Absolutely.
You have cars that are unbelievably connected to the internet for many of their safety features, but also for many features that are kind of questionable for why you would need those data pieces. And then the same risk assessment needs to be gone through as, are you comfortable as a nation with that kind of risk of data from onshore being piped back to the country of origin, and then the legislative means that are applied to that data in the country of origin? And
whether those countries are required by law, even if the company didn't want to do so, to turn that information over to their security services. And we're talking about the same country here.
Absolutely. And I find it fascinating looking at the EU at the moment, when they've set themselves hugely ambitious climate targets. And a big component of that is around electrical vehicles. And the key player there are the Chinese electric vehicle firms. And, how does that rub up against some of the quite stringent measures that the EU has taken? Exactly. And it's this constant balance that you have to make when you're in the government hot seat. How do you weigh up which area, if you like, gets priority over a period of time? Because I would suggest that where Australia has moved now is more the kind of guarded engagement piece. That's how I describe it from 22 onwards, which is rebalancing a bit, if you like, the economic piece with China. And again, rightly so, very justified, changing some of especially the international rhetoric around China, but whilst also trying to push forward with reviews and understanding of supply chain and some of the issues like around electric vehicles, for example.
Yeah, if you saw more transparency in business practices, in all of that, and how that information can be used and not used, I think that would be fair game, right? Then they're just innovating.
You've absolutely nailed it with that term, transparency. Because if a provider can genuinely give you that, whether it's the consumer of technology and other services, if they can provide transparency about their supply chain, fantastic. But also the providers of this technology, if they can give you true transparency about how the data is used, where it goes, what access controls there are, then
it's fair game.
Yeah, you can satisfy the requirements on all sides. But that just frankly doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist right now. And this may be a silly question, and I should know the answer, but I don't remember. Does Australia have an equivalent of CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S.? Do you have a similar law?
Never apologize for what you might feel is a silly question. I find they're the best questions. We absolutely do. We established a financial review board, the FIRB, which didn't have a national security component initially, but then did. And this was back in 2017 that happened, alongside a whole raft of other legislations during that phase that I was talking about, the security first piece. And that really revolutionized the way that industry had to look at money flows.
And that's early stage too, or is it late?
Early stage. I mean, it tends to be applied more
mid to late.
Mid to late, but they're much more stringent now on managing where the money is flowing from.
So big technologies, and there is, not to get into an academic discussion, but there is geopolitics and technology. I mean, name your top 5 that you think. Obviously, quantum AI, but I'm not going to put words in your mouth. What do you think? What do you think they are, and why is it essential? As you said earlier, we cannot afford to lose this race.
Yep, absolutely. Another great question. And absolutely right, there's geopolitics playing in it. I mean, that's what I do now. I mean, that's what I'm advising clients on is, how does geopolitics...
And remind everyone the name of your firm.
So it's Protostar Strategy, and what we do essentially is talk to very senior leaders in industry about decision-making, about how they become better equipped at managing and understanding geopolitics and how that relates to technology decisions.
And risk, right?
Exactly.
At the end of the day, it's risk. It's like any other risk.
Absolutely.
But you have to layer that in. But what do you think the big tech plays are here?
So I don't think this would be any surprise to anyone, because it's become such a commonplace part of the tech lexicon and the common conversation. I love the fact that technology gets talked about so much now. As someone who's invested their entire career, PhD included, in looking at new and emerging technologies, it's quite surreal to be in this world. Finally, it's arrived.
What was your dissertation on?
Oh, it was non-lethal technologies. So cyber effects were part of that.
That's how we met first
time,
right?
Exactly. So I was looking at all sorts of weird and wonderful things like electromagnetic pulse, acoustics, sonics, all that sort of thing. It was
the kind of big things now, directed energy, EMP.
Absolutely. So that was where I began my journey in this space. But it's also, managing the translation piece for those that, fair enough, feel uncomfortable with very technical conversations around technology. It's just important that we're all comfortable with tech. And that's not always the case, because often it's clouded in very difficult language. Absolutely. And there's a time and a space for that, and it can be really good fun, but not if you're a senior decision maker who needs to be able to get clarity very, very quickly. And you're not going to have all the time in the world to deal with these issues. So you do need that clarity. So you need a translation to ensure that the information you're working with is based on ridiculous amounts of knowledge and understanding, and creates then cut through when you do make those decisions effectively. Now, there's a really long-winded way of getting back to your technologies. So AI is obviously the zeitgeist of the moment. AI is not a ubiquitous thing. We've been using it masses in industry already, but it's the generative AI takeoff that is really caught everyone's imagination.
And I'm sorry to cut you, but you mentioned translation. It's also application.
Sure.
So technologies can sit around for a long time. It's not until they're applied and utilized that they can sometimes realize their true benefit and impact.
100%.
But sorry to cut you off there. I've never had an unspoken thought. You know that.
Yeah, of course, mate. That's absolutely right. And I think I'm just going to riff off that a moment, because I think you're so right. And there's an important part of this is, whilst we've been talking a lot about national security and risk, businesses need to feel comfortable in the chaos of trying out new technologies and creating right pockets of environments and business cases so that they can trial new tech and not be frightened of it.
Absolutely.
Because that then would lead to economic loss for our economies. So we need to help companies feel comfortable not just with the risk but also how they effectively enable it for their own economic well-being. So
AI.
Yeah, absolutely, it's right up there. I would say biotech is absolutely enormous and is something, we're all getting scared to death by what Elon is up to with Neuralink.
Convergence with AI and other.
It's like we're psychic. This is like psychic viewing as well. We're doing here because you got ahead of like where I was going. So quantum, I would say, is quite clearly one of those. I would say that if we're kind of still working out if it's quite going to work in the way that everyone's hoping it will. But nevertheless, the chances are we will get there with quantum computing. So that is...
We can't afford to lose that one. That is the ultimate game changer.
Absolutely. And then I would just put on top of that the increased connectivity and speed of connectivity and everything that then flows off the back of that. There's a whole raft of other technologies, but let's stick to those. Because to your point, it's then about the almost, how would you call it, the virtuous circle of interactions between those technologies and the way that they reinforce and accelerate innovation in each other. I mean, I'm talking about them like they're beings, and it may be one day that we get there, right? With the
like
artificial general intelligence. I mean, it's interesting with that AGI conversation. I watched Terminator 2 the other night, and it just took me back to, that's always the reference point. It's like, oh my God, the machines are going to kill us all. But it took me back to that thought process. I remember when I was in the job, getting up on stage down in Melbourne about 2019 and talking about AI processes and progress, and said, we're looking at AGI in 50 plus years time. And I found a load of other very
pretty much everyone in the same place.
So I went on a stage recently and I did a bit of background again and my own thoughts on this. 5 years away? And it's just radically shifted, and that will only accelerate as these technologies interact with one another and accelerate, because they all feed into each other. And I think that then presents, if you're a policymaker, I advocated for it all the time, but it created a lot of complexity for how you then delivered policy in that space. We need to see them almost as a whole, because it's going to present such a multitude of policy question marks and concerns, but also opportunities that governments must get ahead of now. And that's frankly something that governments aren't great at times, especially in the tech space. Getting ahead of the policy curve on advanced technologies is not something I would say that governments are brilliant at.
And I'm not sure it ever will be. No. But sometimes at our peril, sometimes it helps innovate, because you don't want to stymie. You don't want the cure to be worse than the disease.
Absolutely right. I'm a firm believer of setting left and right of arc, and then allowing the developers a bit of space to work in that. And as long as you set that left and right of arc quite clearly, and that should include the kind of values that you're expecting technology to produce.
Ethics, values, principles, and that is my, not to overstate it, but I grew up thinking democracy was the only way, and I still think it's the only way. But autocratic regimes who know how to turn to technology can have a pretty big vote in this, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And ultimately, again, it comes to how that information and how that technology is used, and whether it's the individual, whether it's the government, whether it's the Communist Party. Those are all sorts of questions I think we need to think through. Hey, Toby, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So you were the inaugural ambassador for cyber affairs and critical technology, and I actually didn't think about that. That's one of the few that marries those two up, and for good reason. But what was it like standing up your office? Go back to day zero, where you have a new entity within a big ministry and department in a bigger interagency set of issues, where, just like in the U.S., you have your AGO, your Domestic Security Service, your ACES, your Foreign Intelligence Service. Bring us back to sort of day one, and what did that look like? How did that feel?
I remember landing in the office and still feeling that overwhelming sense of, oh wow, I'm in the best job in the world.
I'm happy to hear that. Did that last?
Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
There you go.
The entire way through it. You know, of course, there's always bumps and bruises along the way, but still the best job in the world. And it was my privilege to land on that day zero, having the background that I did in the tech space, and that's what I think landed me the role was the work that I've been doing on cyber and tech and setting up various different organizations like ASPI's Cyber Center and that sort of thing. You know, it led me to this place. And the amazing thing was, that's right.
They do good work. So
that's right.
Our colleagues down
I
under
will
there.
claim responsibility. I set that up back in the day too.
I forgot. That's right.
And that's really where I found my sweet spot is understanding the direction of travel a little bit before others do. I'm not a soothsayer, or I don't have mystic arts. I'm not the brightest guy in the room. All those things, but I just understand. I have this
sharp dude.
canny. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have this canny ability to just see where things are going, and so that for me was amazing. I landed in the office, and genuinely, not to tell tales, it was me and kind of one other person who worked to me, and it was just blank sheet. I was told I had to write.
Is Dennis Richardson? Who was the
secretary? Francis Adamson.
Okay.
Wow, what a secretary! I mean, again, privileged to work with Francis, and she's now governor of Adelaide. Tremendous individual and consummate professional. And she was very gracious in saying, "You know this space. I trust you. The Prime Minister trusts you. Go and get on with it, and I will support you in every way I can." And the good thing that I had, there were two deliverables for the government around me, and it's always important to remember the deliverables, one of which was delivering me. So the government were like, tick, we've delivered Toby, he's in the job, we've got the ambassador in. And the second one was to deliver an international engagement strategy. And that was perfect for me, because that's my sweet spot, is in creating tech strategy and in helping understand what goes on. So to your point, though, is once you get into that process in government, I was determined that, I had my own ideas. So I provided some top lines, but it was about engagement with colleagues across government. So we established all the interdepartmental mechanisms, made sure that everyone was included, and said, this is your opportunity. I'm sure, and I know you're all doing great work internationally already. Get your agenda into this document, which will have great visibility. And that created a momentum, and then managed to do fundraising in government, happens wherever you are in life, rattled the tin and managed to pull a lot more money out of the system. We went from, at that point, we had $1 million to spend on capacity building. By the end of my time in that position, we'd spent well over $100 million. And to me, that's proof of concept and beyond of what the power of the work you were doing.
And this is one area where Australia was ahead of the United States. How many ambassadors are there now, you think, for cyber that have that title? 30 something?
Yeah, maybe something like that. I don't know exactly how many, but look, Chris Painter was, if you like, the original.
The equivalent,
But, in terms of the ambassador role.
But it wasn't until Nate, and it was elevated to a bureau on the Cyber Diplomacy Act, which was passed recently.
Yeah,
so.
And I had some great colleagues. Rob Strayer was awesome in the role too, and Nate just... it's one of my few regrets, actually, when I was just about to leave. Nate came into the position. We could have done some damage together, but it was great to pass the baton over.
Absolutely.
But you're right. It was almost like not only a blank sheet inside a department, and, colleagues were so brilliant at coming to the table with rallying around the position and seeing the value and looking at ways that we could creatively work together. And so much of that I would never be able to tell the tale of, but so many ways it was visible in the progress that we made with international partners. And in all honesty, one of the reasons I was there was to help mainstream these issues inside government. And a measure of success was a very simple one. So I used to host a bi-monthly meeting of all interdepartmental colleagues who had a hand, if you like, in delivering cyber and tech issues. And it was across all of government.
Across government.
Wow.
Okay.
Bring them in.
Yeah.
Intelligence world, national security, community, but way beyond that as well, trade and investment guys, the whole 9 yards, so that you had that understanding of all the equities. So I remember when we first started doing that, maybe 10 people would show up, and it was probably a very strong national security bent that we had on it. By the end
They're
of my
mostly just keeping you in check.
yeah, probably.
No.
But also, I was given such free license to talk that, of course, that creates nervousness in government. But again, there was a lot of support. So I again was very, very lucky. No, it's fine. But by the end of it, we were having to keep people out of the room, and not because they didn't want to hear what they had to say.
There was no space.
Not to believe there was no space in the room. You'd have like 50 plus people wanting to come along to these meetings, and I remember sitting there thinking, God, this is difficult to manage. But actually, that's a measure of success too.
Mm-hmm.
Government has seen, different departments have seen the value of engaging internationally and seeing what it could do for the country, for their departments, for their own careers. And so that was genuinely a measure of success. And, I think it's awesome now seeing so many different countries with building these capabilities. I'm interested to see where it goes next. And I've definitely been putting my mind to a bit of thinking on, what next for the international tech space.
Well, I hope you're right along those lines. And you sort of answered this question, and feel free to punt on it if you like. But most proud of and unfinished business in your previous role? Was there a day, and you gave some great examples of how it did elevate and mobilize, but was there one day where you said, this is awesome, and one day where you said, we got to do more?
So I remember taking soundings from external colleagues before I went into government, and they gave me some great sound advice, which I'm sure is very common. They said, go into government expecting you can achieve 3 things, and if you achieve one of those, you've knocked it out of the park. I can hand on heart say I lost count of the things that genuinely we achieved.
Awesome.
And that is, okay, I helped with that and maybe helped create with some of the idea and leverage to do that, but it was because colleagues came to the table and they really came to the party. So it's difficult pinpointing. If there's one thing that was a labor of love for me, and I got a really proud, quiet moment, and I didn't reach out to anyone when it happened. It was about cyber sanctions. When I first came in,
boom,
I said, we've got to do this, and 6 years of trying to get there.
Blood, sweat, and tears, you got there.
Yeah, and I kept going, got them passed through Parliament, didn't get to use them before I left. So it's almost like I felt so proud when the Australian government announced that they were using this architecture that I'd helped build over 6 years. But I quietly kept it to myself. So I felt proud, but also it was almost my biggest regret when I left was that we hadn't quite got there. But, I mentioned the kind of money that we invested, the partnerships we built, all of these positive outcomes that we help partners achieve, whether it be Cybersecurity Operations Center and PNG, creating results for the government, whether it be, all sorts of other things, many of which I couldn't talk about. Like, there were so many proud moments. That's why I say still now, biggest privilege of my life, and still always will thank colleagues for the way that they rallied around it.
And that is awesome. And yes, this is by definition a team sport. No one's going this alone.
Exactly.
But you still need to get people on the field. You still need to do the arm twisting, the cajoling, and everything else to get people on that field. And like you said, it started with 10 in your tech group, and it grew. As
you well know, Frank, I have a certain way of doing business, and you may be dealing with incredibly serious issues, but if you want to get people on board, there's got to be some humanity in the way that you deal with everyone. So I hated the moments when it did get a bit friction building. I just felt by kind of power of personality and my ability I know I have to bring people along on a journey, it was brilliant. And others just rallied and kind of went way above and beyond. So it was still, what a privilege to build something like that out over 6 years and see it flourish now. And, Brendan doing an awesome job in the role too.
Toby, what questions didn't I ask that I should have?
Oh my God. There are so many that you could go into. You could have talked about all of the work that we tried to do on deterrence and never quite seemingly got there.
You and I would never get over that conversation because I think it would be a lengthy one.
Exactly. No, I think we've covered so much in that conversation. I think there is always an infinite amount that you can talk about. And I think that's the joy of a podcast like yours, is that there will always be new material. There'll always be more to say. Maybe you should just invite me back for a second chapter.
Sounds like a definite. Toby, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your leadership over the years, and thank you for leaving us in a better place than we were. So that's worth its weight in gold. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.